My name is Maya, and I am 34 years old. I stood in front of 450 of New York's elite listening to my husband of 5 years auction me off to the highest bidder for $30. The crowd roared with laughter, my family leading the mockery. They thought they were humiliating a helpless, unemployed housewife who survived solely on her husband's charity. They had absolutely no idea that the woman they were laughing at was the shadow fixer who actually owned the very ground they were standing on. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of people whose lives you secretly financed. The screech of microphone feedback pierced the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, silencing the classical music and clinking crystal glasses. I sat at table 1, wearing a navy gown I bought myself, though everyone assumed Julian paid for it. Julian stood on the main stage, an expensive bourbon swaying in his hand. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, fully intoxicated by the liquor and his inflated ego. This was supposed to be his triumphant night. It was a charity gala for his investment fund, a desperate attempt to secure capital to cover his mismanagement. Instead of focusing on his business, he made me the evening's entertainment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Julian slurred heavily into the microphone, pointing a steady, accusing finger directly at my table. We have auctioned off the vintage cars. We have auctioned off the weekend in Aspen. But I have one final item for you tonight. $30. Do I hear $30 for this useless wife of mine? A stunned pause washed over the room, quickly replaced by nervous laughter that swelled into cruelty. I felt the gaze of the city's wealthiest socialites burning my skin. She does not work, she does not bring in a single dime, and all she does is sit at home and drain my credit cards. Julian laughed, leaning heavily against the podium to keep his balance. Who wants her $30 and she is yours? The laughter erupted into a deafening roar. 450 of New York's executives and friends laughed at my expense. From the next table, a loud, piercing whistle cut through the noise. It was Marcus Julian's brother-in-law and vice president. A tall African-American man who resented my presence. Marcus slapped the table in delight. He cheered while his wife Isabella snickered behind her champagne flute. I did not cry. I did not shrink into my seat. I had spent years dealing with Julian's arrogance, but tonight was the final thread snapping. I simply took a sip of my sparkling water, set the crystal glass down with absolute precision, and smoothed the invisible wrinkles from my dress. I was preparing to stand up and walk out of that toxic room forever. Just as I pushed my chair back, the double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open, making the nearest guests jump up. The heavy thud echoed against the high ceilings, cutting the cruel laughter completely short. Elias Thorne stepped into the room. At 45, he was a legend in the venture capital world, a ruthless billionaire known for destroying companies. He was the exact white whale investor Julian had been trying to court for the past 6 months to save his sinking fund. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop as Elias walked down the center aisle, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression colder than ice. He completely ignored Julian on the stage. He did not look at the board members. He walked directly to table number 1. He stopped right next to my chair. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see why the most powerful man in the city had crashed this disastrous gala. Elias looked up at the stage, his voice cutting through the thick tension without needing a microphone. $5 million. Julian's drunken smile completely vanished. The color drained from his face as he stared at the billionaire in utter confusion. He lowered the microphone, his hands trembling, bourbon splashing over the rim of his glass. Elias did not wait for a response. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a solid black titanium card, and dropped it onto the tablecloth right in front of me. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. "Your consulting retainer for this month, ma'am," Elias said, bowing his head slightly toward me with absolute respect. "I apologize for the delay. Your financial strategies saved my firm from a hostile takeover last week, and I prefer to pay my crisis fixers on time." The silence shattered into frantic whispers. I picked up the black card, slipped it into my clutch, and stood up. I offered Elias a polite nod, turning my back on the stage where Julian stood frozen. Marcus choked on his drink, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at the titanium card in my hand. "Shall we leave, Elias?" I asked, my voice calm and steady, projecting power I had kept hidden for years. "My car is waiting outside," he replied, gesturing toward the exit. As I took my first step down the aisle, heavy footsteps pounded down the stage stairs. Before I could reach the center of the room, a hand clamped down on my wrist with bruising force. I gasped in pain. Julian yanked me backward, his breath reeking of bourbon and sudden panic. His fingers dug into my skin as he glared furiously between me and the billionaire. "Where the hell do you think you are going?" Julian hissed, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and fear. "And how exactly does my unemployed housewife know, Elias Thorne, you belong to me?" He added, his grip tightening as the room watched our confrontation unfold. Julian tightened his grip on my wrist and yanked me forward. He dragged me past the bewildered waitstaff and forced me down the narrow service hallway toward the VIP dressing rooms. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I did not struggle or shout. I simply let him pull me along, matching his frantic, drunken pace with cold, calculated silence. The contrast between his unraveling composure and my absolute stillness only fueled his rage. He shoved me into the main VIP dressing room and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind us. The harsh fluorescent lights framing the vanity mirrors illuminated the sweat beading on his forehead. He backed me against the makeup counter, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. "Who do you think you are?" Julian screamed, his face inches from mine. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You are my wife. You do not make spectacles of yourself, and you certainly do not walk away with my investors. I demand to know how you got that card from Elias." Before I could formulate a response, the dressing room door burst open, hitting the wall with a deafening crash. Marcus stormed into the room with his wife Isabella trailing closely behind him. Marcus was practically vibrating with anger, his usually immaculate suit looking rumpled as he marched directly toward me. Isabella crossed her arms, leaning against the closed door to block my only exit. She wore an expression of supreme aristocratic disgust. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" Maya Marcus demanded, his voice booming off the mirrored walls. "We have institutional investors out there waiting for answers. We have a $50 million shortfall, and you pull a stunt like this in public." "I am not playing any games, Marcus," I replied calmly, adjusting the strap of my clutch. "Your business partner auctioned me off like livestock. I merely accepted a better offer." Marcus scoffed loudly, pacing the length of the small room. "You have got some nerve playing the victim here. Do not think we do not know what this is really about. You have spent the last 4 years sitting at home doing absolutely nothing. Ever since the miscarriage, you have contributed zero to this family. Julian has funded your entire pathetic existence. He pays for your clothes, your food, your car, while we work 80-hour weeks to keep this fund afloat." Isabella chimed in from the door, her tone dripping with venom. "You have been a parasite, Maya. Julian gave you a life of luxury when you brought nothing to the table. And this is how you repay him, by throwing a tantrum at the most critical gala of his career." Marcus stopped pacing and stepped right into my personal space, his dark eyes narrowed with malicious accusation. "Tell me the truth, Maya. Are you sleeping with Elias to ruin our pitch? Did you spread your legs for a billionaire just to sabotage the only deal that can save this firm from insolvency? You know we need his capital by Friday, or the feds will tear us apart." Julian, emboldened by his brother-in-law and sister, stepped forward. His bruised ego demanded a physical release. He raised his hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the confined space. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow. A dull, stinging pain radiated across my left cheek, but my mind remained perfectly clear. "You ungrateful parasite," Julian spat, glaring down at me. "You tried to embarrass me in front of the entire board of directors. You set this up to make me look weak." I slowly turned my head back to face him. I did not raise my hand to my cheek. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. The woman who would have cried over his cruelty died years ago. I looked at the three of them standing there, so confident in their perceived superiority. They truly believed I was trapped in their web of financial control. I opened my designer clutch with deliberate slowness. I reached inside, past the black titanium card Elias had given me, and pulled out a standard plastic hotel keycard. I looked Julian dead in the eye and threw the piece of plastic hard against his chest. It bounced off his expensive tuxedo jacket and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "You will not be needing a ride home tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a register so cold it made Isabella flinch. "Your blonde assistant is waiting in room 402 at the Marriott. I suggest you hurry before she drinks the minibar dry." Julian's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained from his face as he stared at the keycard on the floor. He opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to figure out how the invisible housewife had uncovered his most guarded secret. "And Julian," I added, stepping closer to him, until he was forced to back up against the vanity. "The cheap perfume on your collar is exactly what you are. A $30 man." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella pushed off the door, her eyes darting from the keycard to her brother. She was not angry on my behalf. Isabella cared only about optics and liability. She marched up to Julian and delivered a vicious slap to his other cheek. The sound was even louder than the one he had given me. "You absolute idiot!" Isabella shrieked, her pristine facade cracking. "Are you out of your mind? Do you know what a scandal with a subordinate will do to our stock price right now? The auditors are already breathing down our necks, and you are booking hotel rooms for your assistant on the company card." Julian stammered, raising his hands defensively. "Isabella, I can explain, it is not what it looks like." I stepped around their bickering, walking purposefully toward the door. I had delivered my message, and I had a crisis management empire to run. But before I could reach the brass handle, Marcus lunged sideways, inserting his large frame between me and the exit. He crossed his arms, blocking my path completely. "Where do you think you are going?" Marcus growled, his previous panic replaced by cold, calculated malice. "You are not walking out of here to go run to Elias." "Get out of my way, Marcus," I warned, maintaining direct eye contact. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a dark, threatening whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya. If you walk out that door, you leave with absolutely nothing. You do not get the house. You do not get the cars. We will freeze every single credit card attached to your name by morning. You will be out on the street with the clothes on your back. You are a housewife with zero income and a massive gap in your resume. You will starve without us." I stared at him, memorizing the exact look of arrogant certainty on his face. He actually believed he held the winning hand. "Move," I said one final time. "You are making a huge mistake," Maya Julian called out from behind me, his voice regaining some of its arrogant bite. "You step through that door and the marriage is over. You get nothing." I reached past Marcus, grabbed the brass handle, and shoved the door open. I did not look back as I walked out into the cool night air, leaving them to drown in the shallow puddle of their own delusions. They thought they had stripped me of my power, but they had only handed me the match to burn their entire kingdom down. The morning sun spilled across the hardwood floors of the master bedroom, but it offered no warmth. I stood perfectly composed beside my open leather suitcase, folding my garments with deliberate precision. The gala the night before had drawn the battle lines, and I was preparing to leave the battlefield on my own terms. I secured the zipper on my travel bag, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the quiet house. The bedroom door did not just open, it splintered inward with a violent crash. Julian stood in the doorway, the stench of stale alcohol and cheap perfume still clinging to him, though he had changed into a sharp charcoal suit to project authority. He was not alone. Beside him stood a man with a slicked-back haircut, carrying an expensive leather briefcase and wearing a smug, predatory grin. I recognized him instantly. Richard Vance, a notoriously ruthless New York divorce attorney who specialized in leaving ex-wives entirely destitute. Julian marched into the room and hurled a thick manila folder onto the center of my meticulously packed suitcase. The heavy stack of papers spilled out, displaying bold legal headers. Notice of eviction. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Julian crossed his arms, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of dominance. "Sign them," Julian ordered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. both the eviction notice and the divorce papers. Richard here has been working all morning to ensure you do not get a single dime of my money. The prenuptial agreement you blindly signed 5 years ago is airtight. It states explicitly that alimony and equitable distribution are entirely contingent on the presence of heirs. Since you spent the last 4 years failing to give me a child, you leave this marriage with nothing. Richard stepped forward, tapping a gold pen against his palm. My client is being exceptionally generous by giving you 30 minutes to vacate the premises, Maya. As you know, this property is securely held within the Julian family trust. Under state law, you have absolutely no equity here and no claim to the estate. I suggest you call a cab and leave quietly before we make this public and humiliate you further. I looked down at the divorce papers and then back up at Julian's triumphant face. He truly believed he was severing my lifeline. He believed the tragedy of my miscarriage was his ultimate legal loophole, his get-out-of-jail-free card to discard me. He thought I was just a fragile, heartbroken woman who had spent 4 years weeping in the guest room. He had no idea that while he was busy embezzling funds and sleeping with his assistant, I had spent the last 4 years building a financial fortress he could not even begin to comprehend. I did not beg. I did not shed a single tear or raise my voice in protest. I calmly reached into my tailored blazer pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a direct local number. I held the phone to my ear, keeping my eyes locked dead on Julian. "Yes, I am at the property now," I said into the receiver, my tone purely transactional. "You can come upstairs." Julian let out a harsh, grating laugh. "Who is that? Are you calling a cheap moving company? Or maybe you are begging Elias Thorne to send his private helicopter for you. Let me guess your billionaire sugar daddy woke up this morning and realized you are nothing but a massive liability in the daylight. You are going to be living in a motel by tonight, Maya." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. "You have always been terribly blind to your own vulnerabilities, Julian," I replied, stepping away from the suitcase and picking up my sleek leather briefcase. "You mistake noise for power." Heavy rhythmic footsteps echoed up the grand mahogany staircase. The distinct sound of police radio static crackled in the hallway. 2 uniformed county sheriffs appeared in the doorway, their hands resting casually near their utility belts. They looked past the aggressive divorce attorney and stepped into the room. Julian's smile widened into a victorious grin. He turned to the sheriffs, gesturing toward me as if I were a common criminal trespassing in his home. "Officers, perfect timing," Julian announced smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. "My attorney and I are executing a lawful eviction. This woman is refusing to vacate my family property. Please escort her off the premises immediately. Use force if you have to." The lead sheriff, a tall man with a stern, weathered expression, looked past Julian completely. He stepped further into the bedroom, his eyes scanning the space before settling directly on me. "Mom, is this the individual refusing to vacate the property?" the sheriff asked politely. Julian frowned, his arrogant posture faltering as he glanced between the sheriff and me. "Wait, what are you talking about? I am the homeowner. I pay the property taxes. She is the one being evicted." I clicked open the dual locks on my briefcase and reached into a hidden velvet compartment. I pulled out a crisp, notarized document bearing the official legal seal of the state of Delaware. I walked straight past a bewildered Julian and handed the document directly to the sheriff. "Julian, your arrogance has always blinded you to your own sheer financial incompetence," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You thought this house was perfectly shielded by your impenetrable family trust. But you secretly leveraged this property 2 years ago, taking out a massive shadow mortgage from an unregulated private lender to cover your catastrophic trading losses. You thought you could hide the bad debt from your investors. You defaulted on that commercial loan 30 days ago." Julian's face turned the color of wet ash. The blood completely drained from his cheeks as the reality of my words hit him. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the document from the sheriff's hands, but the second deputy immediately stepped into his path, placing a firm hand on Julian's chest to shove him back. "My Delaware LLC bought that distressed debt last week." I continued, stepping closer to him so he could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. "You waived the standard foreclosure waiting periods when you signed that predatory commercial loan. I am not your dependent, Julian. I am the bank. This is my property now. You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property before these officers arrest you for criminal trespassing. The absolute panic in Julian's eyes was something I will savor for the rest of my life. He looked frantically at his aggressive divorce attorney, expecting a miraculous legal maneuver. But Richard Vance was a shark who only swam in safe waters. Recognizing immediately that my Delaware holding company held a legitimate, unassailable claim to the property, Vance snapped his briefcase shut. He did not utter a single word in Julian's defense. He simply turned on his heel and briskly walked out of the bedroom, leaving his client completely defenseless. Julian started to shout something about marital assets, but the lead sheriff stepped forward, grabbing him firmly by the bicep. "The 5 minutes are up," the officer stated, his voice leaving zero room for negotiation. They did not let him pack a bag. They did not let him retrieve his expensive watch collection or his customized golf clubs. They marched him down the grand mahogany staircase and straight out the heavy oak front doors. The crisp morning air hit him hard. He stumbled down the stone steps, shivering in the silk pajama trousers and undershirt he had haphazardly thrown on before kicking my door open. I walked casually out onto the second-floor wrought-iron balcony, looking down at the front lawn. The manicured hedges and perfectly cut grass provided a beautiful stage for his ultimate humiliation. Several of our wealthy neighbors had already stepped out onto their porches, drawn by the commotion and the flashing lights of the sheriff cruisers. Julian tried to cover his face, hiding behind his hands as the officers pointed him toward the curb. He stood there barefoot on the cold concrete, a fallen king locked out of his own castle. Tires screeched loudly at the end of the street. A sleek black Mercedes slammed on its brakes, pulling up violently onto the curb right next to Julian. Marcus shoved the driver door open and sprinted across the pristine lawn. He did not look at the police officers. He grabbed Julian by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I have been calling you for an hour, Julian. The feds are here." Julian blinked, his bloodshot eyes wide with terror. "What do you mean the feds are here?" "The Securities and Exchange Commission," Marcus hissed, but his frantic volume carried his words directly up to my balcony. "They raided the downtown office at dawn. They are freezing the main operating accounts. Julian, we have a massive liquidity crisis, and the auditors are actively digging through the offshore ledgers right now. If they find the phantom trades we used to cover last quarter's losses, we are dead. They will charge us with wire fraud by the end of the week. We are facing 20 years in federal prison." Julian gripped his own hair, pacing erratically on the grass. "Elias Thorne," he stammered. "We need Elias. If we secure his $50 million capital injection by Friday, we can plug the hole before the SEC completes the audit. Call him Marcus. Beg him." I watched Marcus run his hands over his face, his polished exterior completely crumbling. "Elias will not take my calls," Marcus shouted. "His secretary blocked my number. We have zero leverage, Julian. The deal is dead." Julian looked up frantically, scanning the exterior of the house, until his eyes locked onto me standing on the balcony. He pointed a trembling finger upward. "She has leverage." Julian choked out, his voice raw with sudden, desperate realization. "Elias paid her $5 million last night. He called her his crisis fixer. She left the gala with him, Marcus. Maya has his ear." Marcus slowly turned his head to look up at me. I stood perfectly still, resting my hands on the cold iron railing. I wore a tailored crimson pantsuit, my hair flawlessly styled, projecting the exact opposite of the broken housewife they expected me to be. Marcus stared at me, and I could see the gears turning in his ruthless mind. He realized that the woman he had mocked and belittled for years was now the only person standing between him and a federal prison cell. But Marcus was not a man who knew how to ask for help. He only knew how to threaten. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his dark eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. A second later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and accepted the call, bringing it to my ear without breaking eye contact with the men on my lawn. "You think you have won?" Marcus spat, his voice low and venomous through the receiver. "You think you can steal this house and leave us to drown? You are wrong, Maya. You are going to fix this. You are going to get Elias Thorne to sign that $50 million term sheet by tomorrow morning. I smiled, looking down at him. And why exactly would I do that, Marcus? Because I do not just make blind threats. Maya Marcus growled, a triumphant edge returning to his tone. You left the gala with Elias, but you did not go home. I paid the concierge at the Grand Marquis Hotel. We have the security footage of you walking directly into Elias Thorne's private penthouse suite at 1 in the morning. We have time-stamped photos of you entering his room while you are still legally married to Julian. He paused, letting the heavy threat settle. You get Elias to sign the capital injection, or I leak every single photo to the press, Marcus hissed. I will send the security footage to the tabloids, to the divorce courts, and to every major financial blog in the city. I will ruin your reputation, and I will drag Elias Thorne's pristine public image through the mud. You will both be front-page scandals by noon. Get the deal done, Maya. He hung up the phone. Down on the lawn, Marcus shoved Julian into the passenger seat of the Mercedes. He glared up at me one last time, a smug look of victory returning to his face before he got behind the wheel and sped away, leaving deep black tire marks on my pristine driveway. I lowered my phone, tapping the screen to open my messaging app. Marcus truly believed that public shame was my greatest weakness. He believed that the threat of a scandal would force me back into submission. He had absolutely no idea that Elias and I had spent the entire night in that penthouse suite, analyzing the stolen ledgers I had smuggled out of Julian's home office. The security footage was not a threat. It was merely a poorly timed photograph of my ultimate trap snapping shut. I looked at the aggressive text message Marcus had sent as a follow-up, demanding immediate compliance. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I typed my response with steady, deliberate keystrokes. I will see you at the family dinner tonight to discuss the terms. The county sheriffs drove Julian away, leaving a thick, tense silence hovering over my property. The flashing red and blue lights vanished down the manicured street, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its quiet, affluent rhythm. I stepped back inside my house. It was finally mine, not just a cage dressed up in expensive silk and false promises. I walked through the vaulted entryway, the echo of my heels a steady metronome against the imported Italian marble. I needed to move fast. Marcus thought his pathetic threat would break me. He believed the fear of public scandal could override my desire for absolute vengeance. He vastly underestimated the woman he had spent 5 years insulting. I bypassed the grand staircase and headed straight for the private elevator tucked behind the library. I hit the button for the underground garage. The heavy steel doors slid open, and I slid into the driver's seat of my black Porsche Panamera. Julian thought he bought this car for me as an anniversary gift. He never bothered to check the registration. My holding company owned the title outright. I drove out of the suburban enclave, merging onto the highway and heading straight into the heart of Manhattan. The city skyline rose in the distance, a concrete jungle where apex predators tore each other apart for sport. I was heading to my true domain. 30 minutes later, I pulled into the private underground parking structure of a sleek, unmarked high-rise in the financial district. There was no corporate logo on the building directory. The elevators required a biometric scan to access the upper floors. This was my secret weapon, the life Julian and his arrogant family completely ignored because they were too busy admiring their own reflections. I was not a useless housewife. I was the lead crisis PR and financial fixer for New York's ultra-wealthy. When billionaires found themselves on the brink of catastrophic public ruin or facing federal indictment, they called me. I made their problems disappear. I buried their secrets, rewrote their narratives, and dismantled their enemies. I stepped out of the private elevator on the 42nd floor. The reception area was stark minimalist and completely silent. My assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Clara, looked up from her monitors as I walked in. "He is waiting for you in the main conference room," Clara said, her voice low and professional. "He arrived 10 minutes ago." "Thank you, Clara," I replied, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. "Ensure we are not interrupted." I pushed open the frosted glass doors of the conference room. The space offered a panoramic view of the Hudson River, but the man sitting at the long mahogany table was not interested in the scenery. Elias Thorne sat leaning back in one of the leather executive chairs, sipping a cup of black coffee. He looked completely relaxed, a stark contrast to the absolute panic currently consuming Julian and Marcus. Maya, Elias said, offering a small approving smile as I entered. I see your morning was productive. Julian is out of the house, I replied, taking the seat opposite him. The property is secured under my LLC. Elias set his coffee cup down. Good. Now let us talk about the real problem. I had my forensic accounting team tear through the preliminary data you sent me last night. It is much worse than you thought, Maya. I opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard to bring up the encrypted files Elias' team had transmitted. Show me. Elias leaned forward, his expression turning razor sharp. Your husband is a fool, but his brother-in-law is a legitimate criminal. Julian's investment fund is essentially operating as a high-level Ponzi scheme. Marcus has been cooking the books for the last 18 months. They are taking new capital and using it to pay off the early investors while funneling millions into unregistered offshore accounts to cover their trading losses. I stared at the financial models glowing on the screen. The depth of their incompetence was staggering. They were bleeding money, and Marcus was trying to patch the sinking hull with counterfeit tape. The SEC raid this morning was inevitable. Elias continued. They were tipped off by an anonymous whistleblower, probably a junior analyst who realized they were being set up to take the fall. Marcus thinks he can blackmail me into securing your $50 million capital injection, I said, looking up from the screen. He has security footage of me entering your hotel suite last night. He is threatening to leak it to the tabloids and frame it as an affair. Elias let out a low, rumbling laugh. Let him try. I own the board of directors at 3 different media conglomerates. If he tries to leak those photos, my people will intercept them before they ever see a printing press. I can crush them legally by the end of the day, Maya. I can hand the SEC the final nail for their coffins, and Julian and Marcus will be facing federal indictments before sunset. I looked at the billionaire, my mind calculating the angles. A federal indictment was clinical. It was sterile. It involved lawyers and plea deals and minimum security white-collar prisons. It was not enough. No, I said, closing my laptop. I do not want you to hand the evidence to the SEC. Elias raised an eyebrow. You want to protect them. I want to dismantle them myself, I replied, my voice perfectly level. A federal indictment is too quick. I want Marcus to look me in the eye when his empire collapses. I want him to know that the useless housewife he spent years humiliating is the one holding the axe. Elias smiled, a dangerous, predatory expression. I knew there was a reason I kept you on retainer, Maya. How do you want to play this? I need access to their private network, I said. Julian is sloppy. He uses the same password for everything. I can bypass his personal firewall, but I need your team to run interference if they detect a breach. Consider it done, Elias said, standing up from the table. I will have my tech team monitor the network traffic. You have until the dinner tonight. Do not let me down, Maya. I will not, I promised. Elias left the conference room, leaving me alone with the silence and the screens. I connected my laptop to my secure server and began the systematic infiltration of the Julian family trust. Julian was indeed sloppy. Within 15 minutes, I bypassed his personal security protocols and gained full access to the shared family cloud server. This was the digital vault where Julian, Marcus, and Isabella kept their most guarded secrets. I bypassed the standard financial ledgers and dove straight into the hidden encrypted folders Marcus maintained. I ran a decryption sequence slicing through his pathetic attempts at cybersecurity. The folders cracked open, spilling their contents across my screen. I expected to find the offshore bank accounts Elias had mentioned. I expected to find the dummy corporations and the falsified tax returns. I found all of that neatly categorized in folders named with generic corporate acronyms. But as I pulled up Marcus' personal bank statements, cross-referencing them against the offshore accounts, I noticed an anomaly. It was a recurring monthly payment heavily disguised through a shell company, but the routing numbers traced back to a very specific medical facility. I ran a quick trace on the routing number. The facility was an ultra-exclusive private maternity clinic located just outside of Connecticut. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in confusion. Marcus was making massive continuous payments to a maternity clinic. The amounts were staggering, suggesting top-tier VIP medical care. But that made absolutely no sense. Isabella Marcus' wife had suffered from severe endometriosis in her 20s. The entire family knew she was completely infertile. She had loudly and publicly declared that she had zero interest in adoption or surrogacy. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes tracking the payment history. The payments had started exactly 7 months ago. If Isabella could not have children, and Marcus was secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into a high-end maternity clinic, then who exactly was Marcus paying for? I pulled the encrypted files onto a sleek silver USB drive, slipping it into my tailored jacket pocket. The question of who Marcus was paying to have a child would be answered soon enough, but the anticipation of watching his arrogant facade shatter into a million pieces was the only fuel I needed. I left my office, shutting down the secure servers, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The restaurant Julian had chosen for this supposed family summit was predictably ostentatious. Le Sommet sat at the top of a midtown skyscraper, boasting imported crystal chandeliers and a menu designed entirely to separate fools from their money. It was exactly the kind of place the Julian family used to project power they no longer actually possessed. I handed my coat to the coat check and followed the hostess toward the back of the establishment. She led me to a private dining room tucked safely away behind heavy velvet curtains. I pushed the thick crimson fabric aside and stepped into the viper pit. They were all there, arranged around a massive oak table like a royal court, awaiting their disobedient subject. Julian sat at the head of the table wearing a freshly pressed navy suit, looking incredibly put together for a man who had spent the morning being thrown out of his own house by county sheriffs. Marcus sat to his right, exuding a nervous, predatory energy. Isabella was positioned perfectly beside Marcus, rigid and immaculate. At the opposite end sat Julian's mother, Beatrice. I barely had time to pull out my own chair before Beatrice launched her assault. She did not bother with pleasantries. She never did. For 5 years she had made it her personal mission to remind me that I came from nothing, while they came from generational wealth. A wealth that was currently evaporating. You have caused quite enough chaos for one single day, Maya. Beatrice announced, her voice dripping with absolute aristocratic condescension. I understand you are having some sort of dramatic emotional breakdown regarding your marriage, but destroying my son's business out of pure spite is unacceptable. It ends tonight. I sat down, placing my clutch on the table. Good evening to you too, Beatrice. You are looking remarkably calm for a woman whose family legacy is currently being investigated for federal wire fraud. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin, furious line. You are going to do your wifely duty, Maya. You are going to swallow whatever pride you think you have left, and you are going to beg your billionaire sugar daddy for the money to save your husband's fund. We are the family that gave you everything. You owe us this. I signaled the waiter for a glass of Cabernet. I let the sheer absurdity of her demand hang in the air. She actually expected me, the woman they had spent half a decade treating like an uneducated charity case, to fix their catastrophic financial crimes by begging a man they assumed I was sleeping with. The delusion was breathtaking. Marcus, clearly impatient with his mother-in-law's lecture, leaned forward and slapped a thick manila envelope onto the center of the table. He slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of my empty plate. We are done playing games, Maya. Marcus said, his dark eyes locked onto mine. Those are printed copies, time-stamped, high-definition security footage from the Grand Marquis Hotel. They show you walking directly into Elias Thorne's private penthouse suite at 1 in the morning and not leaving until dawn. The press will have an absolute field day with this. A bitter, discarded wife sleeping with a venture capitalist to secure a payout. It is a pathetic story, but the tabloids will eat it alive. I reached out and tapped the edge of the envelope with my index finger. I did not bother opening it. I already knew exactly what the blurry, grainy photos looked like. Julian puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie as he delivered his rehearsed lines. He truly believed he held the winning hand. I am willing to be the bigger person here, Maya Julian said, projecting a sickeningly fake smile. I know you were hurting because of our separation. I know you acted out of desperation to feel important. I will forgive your infidelity. I will not mention it in the divorce proceedings. We can keep this entirely quiet. Just get the deal done. Get Elias to sign the $50 million term sheet by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we can all walk away from this clean. I let my eyes wander over the faces of the family I had married into. Beatrice was nodding along with Julian's pathetic speech, genuinely believing her son was offering me a gracious pardon. Isabella sat quietly swirling her martini, completely detached from the reality of her husband's criminal enterprise. They were all so blind. They lived in a carefully constructed bubble of privilege, and they were demanding that I protect it for them. The waiter approached silently, placing a glass of dark red wine to my right before quickly retreating from the tense room. I picked it up by the stem, feeling the cool glass against my skin. I brought it to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, entirely unbothered by the heavy stares bearing down on me from across the table. The wine was excellent, bold and complex, a sharp contrast to the predictable fools sitting in front of me. $50 million, I said, setting the glass down with a soft clink. You want me to extort $50 million from one of the most powerful men in New York to cover up your phantom trades and offshore embezzling. And your ultimate leverage is a stack of blurry hotel photos that you think proves an affair. It is more than enough to ruin your reputation permanently. Marcus snapped his patience, fracturing as he leaned closer. You have until morning, Maya. You are going to make the call right now. I am afraid that is not going to happen, Marcus, I replied, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. You see, your fatal flaw has always been assuming you are the smartest person in the room. You spent 5 years treating me like a naive housewife who could barely balance a household checkbook. You never bothered to look past your own arrogance to see who I really am. I unclasped my leather clutch and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the smooth metal of the silver USB drive. I pulled it out and set it on the table right next to the thick envelope of blackmail photos. Marcus frowned, his eyes darting to the small device. What is that? I did not answer Marcus. I bypassed Julian entirely. My gaze locked directly onto the impeccably dressed woman sitting quietly beside her husband. Before we talk about my alleged infidelity, Isabella, I said, my voice slicing through the tense silence of the private dining room like a scalpel. I pushed the silver drive across the white tablecloth. It slid smoothly, coming to a stop right next to her martini glass. Why don't you ask your husband Marcus why he is wiring $10,000 a month to a private maternity ward in Miami? Isabella's perfectly manicured fingers snapped down on the silver drive with the speed of a striking viper. The metallic clink echoed loudly against the fine china. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. Her knuckles turned white as she clutched the small piece of metal against her chest. She turned her head slowly, her wide eyes locking onto her husband. Marcus erupted into sheer panic. He lunged across the white linen tablecloth, knocking over a crystal water glass in his desperate attempt to snatch the drive back. The heavy goblet shattered, sending a wave of ice water and jagged shards across the expensive floral centerpiece. Give me that, Isabella, Marcus demanded, his voice pitching into a frantic, shrill bark. Do not listen to a single word she says. Maya is out of her mind. She is trying to distract us with fabricated documents because she knows we have her backed into a corner. Isabella did not let go. She pulled her hand further back, her chest heaving as she stared at the man she had been married to for 7 years. What maternity ward, Marcus? She asked, her voice trembling but surprisingly loud. Who is in Miami? Tell me right now who you are paying $10,000 a month to support. It is a lie, Marcus shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She hacked my accounts and altered the records to save her own skin. She is a desperate, cheating housewife trying to tear our family apart to hide her own sins. Beatrice clutched her chest, gasping loudly, as if the very air in the room had become toxic. This is an absolute outrage, she wailed, looking frantically between her daughter and her son-in-law. Marcus, tell me this instant that you are not squandering our family capital on some Florida mistress. The private dining room dissolved into absolute chaos. Isabella pushed her chair back, standing up to put distance between herself and Marcus. She demanded he unlock his phone and show her his banking app right that second. Marcus continued to shout, throwing wild accusations at me while desperately trying to grab his wife by the wrist to silence her. Beatrice was hyperventilating, demanding the waitstaff bring her a glass of sherry. I sat perfectly still amidst the screaming and the shattered crystal. I picked up my Cabernet and took another slow sip, entirely unbothered by the destruction unfolding around me. This was the reality of the Julian family legacy. A hollow, rotting structure that collapsed the second someone applied a little pressure. Julian realized he was entirely losing control of his own summit. His lifeline was evaporating in front of his eyes. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. He slammed both of his fists onto the oak table with enough force to rattle the silverware. Enough, Julian roared, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. The sudden volume shocked his mother and sister into a momentary stunned silence. Marcus froze, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air. Julian turned his furious, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. The mask of the civilized, forgiving husband completely melted away, revealing the cornered, desperate animal underneath. "You think you are so clever, Maya?" Julian spat, leaning over the table until his face was only inches from mine. "You think you can walk in here, throw a fabricated flash drive on the table, and watch us destroy each other? You think you hold the cards because you stole my house and charmed a billionaire? You hold nothing." He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document, slapping it down next to my wine glass. "I am done negotiating with you," Julian sneered. "I already sent the photos to the editor at the New York Chronicle. They have the time-stamped security footage of you entering Elias Thorne's hotel room. They have the narrative. They are completely ready to publish the exclusive story of Elias Thorne's scandalous affair with a married, desperate woman." Julian tapped the folded paper with a manic energy. "This is a full legal confession of adultery and a transfer of all your LLC assets back to my name. You are going to sign it right now. Then you are going to call Elias and force him to wire the $50 million to my fund immediately. If you do not execute this exactly as I say, the Chronicle publishes the photos at the stroke of midnight. Your reputation will be incinerated, and Elias will drop you the second he becomes a tabloid punchline." He crossed his arms, breathing heavily. He actually thought he had checkmated me. He thought the threat of public humiliation was a universal weapon. I calmly set my wine glass down. I lifted my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my blazer to check my platinum timepiece. "It is 11:55, Julian," I stated, keeping my tone remarkably casual. "5 minutes to midnight, then you better find a pen and start signing." Julian growled, a triumphant sneer stretching across his face. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "You really do not understand the industry you are trying to manipulate, Julian. I know the senior editor at the Chronicle very well. In fact, we do a significant amount of business together. I manage the crisis narratives for half of his board of directors." Julian's sneer faltered slightly, a shadow of doubt creeping into his eyes. "Major digital publications do not wait until the exact stroke of midnight to push an exclusive breaking story," I explained, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. "They always push the article to the homepage 5 minutes early to beat the midnight server traffic and secure the search engine indexing before their competitors." I gestured toward the expensive smartphone sitting next to Julian's plate. "Go ahead, Julian. Open your browser. Check the Chronicle's homepage right now. Let us see if your grand blackmail scheme made the front page." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes darting nervously between Julian and me. "Do not listen to her, Julian. She is bluffing. She is trying to buy time." But the seed of absolute terror had already taken root in Julian's mind. His hands began to shake as he reached for his phone. The glow of the screen illuminated his pale, sweating face in the dim lighting of the private dining room. He opened his browser and navigated to the news site. His thumb trembled as he hit the refresh button. The page loaded. Julian's jaw physically dropped. The air left his lungs in a sharp, wheezing gasp. His eyes widened to the point of tearing as he stared at the glowing screen. The phone slipped from his slick fingers and clattered loudly onto the wooden table facing upward. Marcus leaned over to look at the screen. The remaining color instantly drained from Marcus' face, leaving him looking like a corpse. The bold, red breaking news banner stretched across the entire screen. But the headline had absolutely nothing to do with my alleged infidelity or Elias Thorne. The massive bold text read, "Exclusive Wall Street Fund raided by SEC. Top executives implicated in $50 million Ponzi scheme and offshore embezzlement." Right beneath the devastating headline featured a high-resolution photograph of Marcus and Julian being escorted out of their downtown office building by federal agents earlier that morning. And right below the photograph sat the author byline. The exposé was exclusively authored by M. Cross, the legendary untouchable PR alias I had used for the last 5 years to dismantle corrupt empires. Julian stared at his phone as if the glowing screen had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. The silence in the private dining room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing of two men watching their entire freedom evaporate into thin air. Isabella grabbed Marcus by the collar of his expensive suit, her nails digging viciously into the fabric. She was screaming, demanding answers about the Miami maternity ward, but her voice seemed entirely muted under the crushing, catastrophic weight of the SEC headline. Beatrice looked like she was about to pass out, clutching her pearl necklace with a trembling hand, as her pristine socialite reality collapsed around her. The heavy velvet curtains at the entrance of our private dining room suddenly swept open. The air in the room shifted instantly, dropping 10 degrees as the imposing figure stepped through the threshold. Elias Thorne stepped into the chaos. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable power. He did not look like a man caught in a tabloid scandal. He looked like an executioner arriving to finish the job. Marcus saw Elias and his survival instincts violently kicked in. He shoved his weeping wife aside completely, ignoring the financial ruin and the devastating secret I had just exposed. Marcus scrambled around the edge of the large oak table, his hands raised in a pathetic, desperate gesture of submission. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his slicked back hair. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus gasped, his voice cracking as he practically bowed. "Thank God you are here. Please, you have to ignore this mess. My sister-in-law is completely unstable. She is having a psychotic break and fabricating documents to ruin us. We can finalize the $50 million capital injection right now, just the men. I have the term sheets ready in my briefcase. We can save the fund." Elias did not even blink at Marcus. He treated the desperate, sweating man like a foul stain on the carpet. Elias walked right past Marcus, brushing his shoulder with cold, unyielding indifference, and came straight to my side of the table. He reached out and pulled out the heavy oak chair beside me, a gesture of absolute respect that made Julian's jaw hit the floor all over again. I remained seated, simply watching the beautiful destruction unfold. Elias turned his cold, piercing gaze to the rest of the table. His eyes locked onto Marcus, who was still hovering awkwardly with his hands outstretched, holding nothing but empty air. "You brought my chief strategy officer to a cheap dinner to blackmail her," Elias asked, his voice echoing like thunder in the confined space. The words hung heavy in the air. Julian blinked rapidly, his brain completely failing to process the sentence. He looked at me, then looked at Elias, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "Chief Strategy Officer Julian," repeated dumbly, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about? She is my wife. She does not work. She is just Maya." Elias let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut straight to the bone. "Your wife saved my entire global empire 2 years ago when a hostile takeover nearly gutted my board. She is the absolute genius who mapped out the counteroffensive. She is M. Cross. Maya controls my entire venture capital portfolio. She holds the purse strings to billions, Julian. The only reason your pathetic little fund even got a meeting with my acquisitions team is because Maya wanted to see exactly how deep your fraud went. She is not my mistress. She is my boss when it comes to capital allocation." Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, slumping back into her chair, as if she had been physically struck. The woman she had spent 5 years calling a useless gold digger was the apex predator of Wall Street. Isabella stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and profound awe, finally understanding exactly who she had been insulting at every family holiday. Marcus backed away, slowly hitting the edge of a brass serving cart, the fight completely draining from his body. He realized the woman he had just tried to blackmail with fake infidelity photos was the very person who had orchestrated his federal takedown. He had handed a loaded gun to the sniper who already had him in her crosshairs. But it was Julian who completely shattered. His fragile ego, built entirely on years of belittling me and treating me like a dependent burden, imploded spectacularly. The realization that I was infinitely more successful, more powerful, and more brilliant than he could ever hope to be broke his mind. He had convinced himself I was a fragile bird he kept in a gilded cage. Finding out I was the hawk that just tore out his throat was too much for his sanity to bear. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. His eyes went completely wild, darting from the SEC headline on his phone to Elias, and finally locking onto me with a murderous glare. He let out a primal, guttural scream. Julian grabbed the heavy, serrated steak knife resting next to his pristine dinner plate. He lunged entirely across the wide oak table, sending crystal wine glasses and porcelain plates shattering to the hardwood floor. His suit jacket knocked over the massive floral arrangement. As he scrambled over the polished wood, the knife gripped tightly in his fist, pointing directly at my chest. "You hid this from me," Julian shrieked, spit flying from his lips as his eyes bulged with absolute madness. "You breached your marital fiduciary duty. I am your husband. Whatever you built belongs to me. I legally own half of your secret company, and I will carve it out of you." Julian never even made it past the floral arrangement. Before the heavy silver steak knife could cross the center of the table, a massive shadow detached itself from the doorway. Elias had not come alone. His personal security detail, a man built like a concrete vault, moved with terrifying speed. A massive hand clamped onto Julian's wrist, twisting it violently upward. Julian let out a high-pitched shriek, dropping the knife as it clattered harmlessly against a discarded bread plate. In the next fraction of a second, the guard swept Julian's legs out from under him and slammed him face first into the hardwood floor. Shattered crystal crunched beneath Julian's cheek. He thrashed and gasped for air beneath the crushing weight of the guard's knee pressed directly between his shoulder blades. The polished Wall Street executive was reduced to a writhing, pathetic mess, groaning into a puddle of spilled wine. Elias did not even flinch at the sudden violence. He casually adjusted his immaculate cuffs and looked down at the pathetic display. He pulled out the heavy oak chair beside me, a gesture of absolute respect, and sat down as if he were attending a casual Sunday brunch. He signaled the terrified waiter for a glass of water, completely ignoring the man pinned to the floor. Marcus immediately threw his hands up, taking several frantic steps backward. He was sweating so profusely his silk shirt clung to his chest. He looked between the federal nightmare waiting for him outside and the billionaire titan sitting calmly at the table. Survival instinct took over, completely overriding any remaining family loyalty. "Please, Mr. Thorne," Marcus babbled, wiping his dripping forehead with a shaking palm. "Julian is just under an immense amount of stress. The market has been brutal and he is not thinking clearly. He is overreacting and acting like a complete lunatic. We can just let him cool off and discuss the capital injection like civilized men. I can run the fund without him. We can finalize the $50 million investment right now, just the men. I have the term sheets ready in my briefcase. We can bypass Julian entirely and save the deal." Elias slowly turned his head to look at Marcus. The look of utter disgust on his face was absolute, but he did not speak. He simply deferred to me. "You are not running anything, Marcus," I said, standing up from my chair. I looked down at Julian, who was currently spitting out a mouthful of Cabernet and glass dust. I reached down and picked up my leather tote bag. I unclasped the brass buckle and pulled out a massive black legal binder, setting it down with a heavy thud right where Julian's plate used to be. I flipped it open to a tabbed section filled with highlighted bank statements, offshore routing numbers, and thick stacks of printed evidence. "You want to talk about marital assets, Julian?" I asked, my voice echoing off the silent walls of the private room. You want to talk about your legal right to carve out my company because of your supposed fiduciary duty as my husband? Julian groaned, straining to lift his head from the floor. You are a thief, he hissed, his voice muffled against the wood. You breached your duty. You hid billions from me while playing the dutiful housewife. I am entitled to half. I hid nothing, I replied smoothly, tracing my manicured finger down a printed ledger. I simply stopped depositing my capital into accounts you were actively looting. Let us talk about the $4 million you embezzled from our joint savings over the last 24 months. Let us talk about the phantom consulting fees you wired to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Julian froze. His struggling ceased entirely. The fight instantly drained out of his body, leaving him completely limp under the guard's knee. Beatrice let out a horrified gasp, clutching the edge of the table. Embezzled, she whispered, her eyes darting to her son. Julian, what is she talking about? You told me the market was just going through a temporary downturn. You said the family funds were secure. I flipped a page, revealing a stack of high-definition glossy photographs. They were not blurry hotel lobby shots. They were crystal-clear images of luxury sports cars, diamond necklaces, and pristine real estate deeds. He is not a mastermind, Beatrice, I said, never taking my eyes off the man pinned to the floor. He is a walking cliché. He drained $4 million to fund the lavish lifestyle of his 23-year-old assistant, the blonde from room 402, the one he bought a penthouse for in Tribeca using the equity from the house he thought he was stealing from me. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. A pathetic whimper escaped his throat. You honestly believed you were the predator in this marriage, Julian? I asked, stepping closer so I could look directly down at his humiliated face. You thought I was sitting at home organizing charity galas while you were actively funneling my money to your mistress. You thought I was oblivious to the late nights and the mysterious weekend retreats. I am a forensic venture capitalist. I track missing billions across global markets before breakfast. Did you really think you could hide $4 million from me using a fake invoice generator you downloaded from the internet? Isabella let out a sharp, bitter laugh. She was still clutching the silver USB drive against her chest, looking down at her brother with absolute disgust. You are a fool, Julian, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. You are all absolute fools. You dragged us into this mess to cover your own tracks while you were sleeping with your secretary. I turned another page in the binder, revealing a thick stack of printed emails. I have every receipt, Julian, I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. I have every text message, every wired transfer, and every signed deed. I have already submitted the entire portfolio of your financial crimes to the SEC investigators currently tearing your office apart. You do not own half of my company. You do not own the house. You do not even own the suit you are wearing right now because it was purchased with stolen capital. You are walking out of this restaurant with absolutely nothing but a federal indictment and a mountain of legal debt. Julian let out a broken, sobbing gasp. The reality of his absolute destruction finally crashing down on him. The golden boy of the Julian family legacy was completely erased. He was going to prison, and he was going to be entirely broke when he got there. He had lost the fund, he had lost his wife, and he had lost his freedom. I lifted my gaze from Julian. The room was suffocatingly tense. Beatrice was silently weeping into a napkin, her socialite empire completely reduced to ash. Isabella was trembling, her eyes locked onto her own husband with a terrifying, cold clarity. She had completely stopped caring about Julian's fate. Her mind was entirely focused on the silver drive in her hand and the Miami maternity ward. I noticed movement by the entrance. Marcus was slowly inching backward toward the heavy velvet curtains. He was trying to slip out of the private dining room while the attention was focused on Julian's implosion. He thought he could escape into the night and outrun the federal agents waiting in the lobby. He thought he could abandon his family, his firm, and his wife to save himself. I snapped the heavy black binder shut. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot, freezing Marcus in his tracks. His hand was inches away from the crimson velvet. Marcus, do not leave yet, I called out, my voice slicing through the heavy air. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile that made him visibly flinch. I think Julian needs to hear exactly who is paying for that Miami maternity ward. I tossed a final manila folder onto the ruined table. The thick, glossy photographs spilled out, cascading over the white linen and landing right next to the shattered crystal. They displayed Marcus and Julian's 23-year-old assistant locked in a passionate embrace on a luxury yacht in Biscayne Bay. In the clearest photo, they were smiling brightly, holding up a sonogram. The dining room absolutely exploded. Isabella let out an ear-splitting shriek that rattled the imported crystal chandelier above our heads. The pristine, detached socialite completely vanished, replaced by a woman pushed past the brink of sanity. She lunged at Marcus, her perfectly manicured hands transforming into claws as she grabbed him by the lapels of his tailored suit. She slammed him backward against the heavy wood-paneled wall. "You lying, parasitic coward," she screamed, shaking him with a sudden, terrifying strength. "You are having a child with my brother's mistress." Julian stopped struggling beneath the crushing weight of the security guard's knee. He turned his head, his cheek resting in a puddle of spilled wine and shattered glass, and stared at Marcus in sheer, absolute disbelief. The gears in his mind, previously jammed by rage and humiliation, finally began to turn with horrifying clarity. Marcus panicked, thrashing wildly against his wife's grip. His survival instincts entirely overrode any lingering ability to lie or play the diplomat. He shoved Isabella away hard enough that she stumbled back into Beatrice, who was currently hyperventilating into her linen napkin. Isabella stared at the man she had promised her life to, realizing every luxury vacation, every diamond bracelet, and every loving whisper had been funded by theft and deceit. She had looked down on me for years, believing her union was superior, but she was married to a coward who was stealing from her own brother to fund a secret life. "It was not my fault," Marcus babbled, his voice pitching into a hysterical, breathless whine. He looked down at Julian with a mixture of raw terror and open contempt. Julian was reckless. He was leaving a massive paper trail with his phantom trades. The SEC was already sniffing around the fund 6 months ago. Chloe and I knew the ship was sinking. We had to protect ourselves. "Chloe." Julian choked out the name of his beloved assistant, his voice cracking into a pathetic, raspy whisper. "You and Chloe." "We have been together for over a year," Marcus confessed, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an escape route. "She never loved you, Julian. She thought you were an arrogant fool. You made it so incredibly easy. You thought you were the brilliant mastermind hiding assets from your wife, but you were just blindly signing the documents Chloe put in front of you. You authorized the offshore transfers. You put your name on the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. We just redirected the routing numbers to Miami." Julian let out a hollow, broken sound that barely resembled human speech. The illusion of his own brilliance shattered into a million jagged pieces. The magnitude of the betrayal was biblical. He had spent years treating me like a naive, uneducated charity case, while grooming his beautiful young assistant to eventually replace me. He truly thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess, manipulating everyone around him to secure his ultimate victory. In reality, he was nothing but a useful idiot. Julian realized his entire family, his trusted brother-in-law, and his adoring mistress had been playing him for a fool. They had conspired to drain the company accounts, frame him for the entire federal crime, and leave him holding the bag while they escaped to a sunny paradise with his stolen millions. He was the perfect fall guy. And the baby Julian wheezed, struggling to pull air into his lungs as the guard maintained his iron grip. "The baby," she said, "was mine." Marcus let out a cruel, desperate laugh, running a hand through his ruined hair. "She needed you to stay distracted, Julian. She needed you to feel powerful and virile so you would not look too closely at the quarterly ledgers. The child is mine. I was taking the capital you stole from Maya to build a real family far away from this toxic, rotting empire. You were going to take the federal fall, and we were going to be completely free." Beatrice let out a long, trembling wail, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Her golden boy was a federal criminal and a gullible fool. Her son-in-law was a treacherous parasite. Her family legacy, the aristocratic wealth she wielded like a weapon, was entirely dead. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly, her shoulders shaking as her reality dissolved into dust. I stood tall, watching the absolute decimation of the Julian family. They had spent half a decade trying to convince me I was worthless. They had demanded I beg for my financial life to save their criminal enterprise. They had threatened to ruin my reputation with a stack of blurry hotel photos. Now they were tearing each other to pieces in a private dining room surrounded by shattered glass and spilled wine. Elias sat quietly beside me, his dark eyes watching the scene with cold, detached amusement. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to validate my power and seal their absolute doom. "I am leaving," Marcus shouted, his eyes wild with frantic panic. He looked at the chaos around him, the weeping women, the broken man pinned to the floor, the billionaire titan sitting calmly at the table. "I am not going down for this." Julian signed the papers. "Julian is the one going to prison. I have plausible deniability." Marcus turned away from his weeping wife and sprinted toward the heavy crimson velvet curtains that separated our private dining room from the main restaurant. He moved with the desperate, frantic energy of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. He threw the thick fabric aside, expecting to find the clear path to the lobby and the dark city streets beyond. Instead, he slammed directly into a solid wall of human muscle. Marcus bounced back, stumbling on the polished hardwood floor and nearly losing his balance. He looked up, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Standing in the threshold, blocking the exit completely, were three men wearing dark windbreakers, federal agents. They looked at Marcus with cold professional indifference. The restaurant outside was completely silent, having been entirely cleared out for this exact moment. The lead agent, a tall man with a square jaw and a severe, unyielding expression, stepped forward into the private dining room. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. They clinked loudly in the sudden, terrifying silence of the room, cutting through Beatrice's sobs. "Marcus, you are not going to Miami," the lead agent said. The agent stepped forward with brutal efficiency. He grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the heavy wooden doorframe. The sickening thud echoed through the dining room, followed immediately by the sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs locking securely around Marcus' wrists. Marcus began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he squirmed helplessly against the agent's iron grip. "This is a massive misunderstanding," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. "I am a victim here. My brother-in-law is the one orchestrating the trades. I am just a managing partner. You have the wrong man." The lead agent did not even blink. He pulled a folded warrant from his interior pocket and held it up. "Marcus Julian Vance, you are under arrest. The charges are wire fraud, securities fraud, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Marcus' legs completely gave out. If the two agents holding his arms had not braced him, he would have collapsed face first onto the floor. He dangled between them, a pathetic, sweating mess of a man whose grand escape plan had just dissolved into a federal prison sentence. He turned his head, looking desperately back into the private dining room. His tear-filled eyes found his wife, Isabella. "Please, Marcus," sobbed, begging her. "Call my lawyer. Call the firm. Tell them I had nothing to do with the offshore accounts. Please, Isabella, I love you." Isabella simply stared at him with dead, hollow eyes. She slowly wiped a drop of spilled water from her cheek, her expression completely devoid of any human empathy. She looked at the man who had secretly fathered a child with her brother's mistress, and she let out a short, bitter breath. "Have a safe flight to Federal Holding, Marcus," she said, her voice colder than ice. The agents dragged Marcus away, pulling him through the heavy velvet curtains and out into the main restaurant where dozens of stunned diners watched the disgraced executive being paraded out in steel cuffs. The sound of the heavy restaurant doors clicking shut behind them seemed to break the final thread of sanity holding Beatrice together. She let out a horrifying, hysterical wail. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed heavily into one of the plush dining chairs. Her perfectly styled hair fell out of its pins, hanging in disheveled clumps around her face. The matriarch of the Julian family, the woman who had lorded her aristocratic heritage over everyone she met, was completely shattered. She looked wildly around the ruined room. She saw her daughter standing like a traumatized statue. She saw her son Julian coughing and gasping for air on the floor as Elias' security guard slowly stepped back. Finally, her frantic, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. She looked at the thick black binder sitting on the table. She looked at Elias Thorne, the billionaire titan who was standing silently by my side, acting as my personal shield. Beatrice slid out of her chair and dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled across the floor, ignoring the shards of broken crystal and the puddles of spilled wine. She reached out with trembling hands and physically grabbed the hem of my skirt. "Maya, please, Beatrice," wailed her voice distorted by heavy, gasping sobs. Thick black streams of mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her expensive silk blouse. "You have to stop this. You know Elias Thorne. You control his money. You have the power to make this go away. Tell him to make a call to the regulators. Tell him to buy the firm and pay the fines. You can fix this. You are family. You cannot let my son go to prison. They will not survive it. They will die in there, Maya." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. For 5 years she had made my existence an absolute living hell. She had mocked my clothes, my background, and my education. She had demanded I blindly sign away my rights, and she had actively cheered when her son presented me with a fraudulent confession of adultery. She had wanted to see me destroyed, ruined, and thrown out into the street with absolutely nothing. Now she was begging for her life on her knees. I reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my clothing. I took a deliberate step back, forcing her to look up at me from the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no warmth. I felt only the cold, satisfying clarity of ultimate justice. "You are asking me for mercy, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that carried clearly across the room. "You laughed when your son sold me for $30. You sat there smiling and sipping your sherry while he handed me fake blackmail photos. You demanded I humiliate myself to save his criminal empire. You told me I owed this family my life." Beatrice shook her head wildly, reaching for me again. "We were wrong, Maya. We were so wrong. Please just show some mercy." I stepped back again, leaving her grasping at empty air. "Consider this the tax on your entertainment, Beatrice," I stated coldly. "You wanted to watch a spectacular show tonight. You wanted to watch me break. Now you get to sit in the front row and watch federal prosecutors dismantle your entire bloodline. Your son dug his own grave, and you handed him the shovel. I will not lift a single finger to pull him out." Beatrice let out another agonizing scream, curling into a ball on the floor as she wept uncontrollably. Isabella walked past her mother without a single word, retrieving her coat and walking out of the restaurant, leaving her shattered family behind. On the floor, Julian finally pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. His custom suit was soaked in cheap wine and ruined. A small cut above his eyebrow was bleeding freely down the side of his face. He watched his mother sobbing on the floor. He saw the empty doorway where his brother-in-law had just been hauled away in chains. He looked at me standing tall and untouchable beside one of the most powerful men in the country. Something inside Julian's brain completely snapped. The pressure, the humiliation, and the absolute devastation of his reality finally broke his mind. A low, deep chuckle started in his chest. It rumbled through the quiet dining room, building in volume. Julian dragged himself up to his feet, gripping the edge of the oak table to steady his shaking legs. The chuckle morphed into a loud, erratic laugh. He threw his head back and began laughing maniacally, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. The sound was terrifying, raw, and devoid of any actual humor. He wiped the blood from his forehead, smearing it across his cheek as he locked his wild, manic gaze directly onto me. "You think you have won, Maya?" Julian shouted, his voice echoing with insane, desperate energy. "You think you can just orchestrate a raid and watch me burn? You forgot one minor detail, you stupid, ungrateful housewife. I am still the majority shareholder of the firm. Tomorrow morning at the emergency board meeting, I will liquidate everything and burn it all down before you or the feds get a dime." Julian's manic laughter echoed off the wood-paneled walls, bouncing around the ruined dining room like a trapped bird. He honestly believed his final declaration was a checkmate. He thought he held the ultimate detonator. I did not dignify his psychotic tantrum with a verbal response. I simply looked at him writhing in a puddle of expensive wine and his own blood and turned my back. Elias matched my stride perfectly as we walked out of the restaurant, leaving the ashes of the Julian legacy behind us. The air outside was crisp, clearing the stench of desperation from my lungs. But the night was far from over. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the atmosphere inside my private crisis war room was electric. The sleek glass-enclosed operations center sat high above the sleeping city, buzzing with the low hum of server towers and the blue glow of a dozen wall-mounted monitors. Elias stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, holding a double espresso, watching me dismantle his rivals. His presence was a silent anchor in the middle of a Category 5 financial hurricane. Julian was a pathetic narcissist, but he was not entirely wrong. As the acting CEO and majority shareholder, he still possessed the highest tier of executive clearance at the firm. The SEC raid had secured physical documents and arrested Marcus, but the bureaucratic gears of a federal asset freeze moved notoriously slowly. The official injunction locking down the firm's digital capital reserves would not be legally enforced until the markets opened at 9 in the morning. Julian had a 7-hour window. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was going to use the firm's emergency executive bypass protocols. He intended to log into the mainframe's wire the remaining client funds into offshore untraceable crypto wallets and completely vaporize billions of dollars. Innocent pensioners, teachers' unions, and municipal workers would lose their entire life savings just so a humiliated man could have one final petty victory. I stared at the scrolling data arrays on my primary monitor, my jaw set in a hard line. I absolutely refused to let innocent investors lose their pensions just so Julian could soothe his shattered ego. I was not going to let him burn down the village to warm his own hands. "We need a kill switch," I said, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. "If Julian accesses the global clearing system before 9, he can initiate an irrevocable wire transfer. The feds are moving too slowly. We have to lock him out of his own company internally." Elias stepped up behind my chair, his eyes scanning the rapidly shifting data. "He has unilateral control over the Treasury architecture Maya. You would need a board supermajority to revoke his credentials, and his board is comprised entirely of his cronies. They will never vote him out before sunrise." "I am not going to ask for a vote," I replied, pulling up a heavily encrypted archive. "I am going to trigger an automatic expulsion." I dove straight into the foundational bedrock of Julian's firm. I bypassed the public filings and the polished shareholder reports, digging deep into the original operating agreement drafted a decade ago. My eyes tracked across dense pages of legalese, cross-referencing clauses with the Uniform Commercial Code. Julian was sloppy. He always left the tedious legal details to underpaid associates because he thought he was above reading the fine print. My mind worked at hyperspeed, filtering out the corporate jargon until I found exactly what I was looking for. It was buried deep in the appendix of a revised debt covenant. "Got it?" I whispered, a sharp thrill of adrenaline cutting through my exhaustion. Section 4, Paragraph 9. The Moral Turpitude and Catastrophic Risk Clause. Elias leaned in closer, resting his hands on the back of my chair. "Explain it to me." "When they restructured their debt 3 years ago, the bank forced them to insert a highly specific trigger," I explained, highlighting the text on the screen. "If any managing partner is indicted on federal financial crimes while acting in an official capacity, the debt covenants are instantly breached." But it goes further. It states that if the firm is exposed to imminent catastrophic capital loss due to internal malfeasance, any minority shareholder with institutional backing can execute a hostile lockout to protect the remaining assets. Elias immediately grasped the magnitude of the discovery. Marcus was just arrested on federal wire fraud charges on company time, and Julian explicitly threatened to liquidate client funds in front of a room full of witnesses to evade federal seizure. "Exactly," I said, striking the enter key to compile the legal brief. "The executive board structure is instantly compromised. I can legally execute the hostile lockout and strip Julian of his CEO status, freezing the accounts internally before he even logs on." I sent the compiled brief to a federal judge on speed dial requesting an emergency midnight signature. It was a brilliant maneuver, a flawless legal guillotine. But as the confirmation screen loaded, Elias pointed at a schematic diagram of the firm's security architecture. A judge's digital signature takes time, Elias noted, his voice low and serious. And Julian's executive override is hard-coded into the localized servers. Even with the legal injunction approved, he can still manually authorize the crypto transfer from his physical terminal. The only way to completely sever his access before he pushes the button is to insert the physical master security tokens directly into the mainframe. My stomach plummeted. Elias was right. The digital lockdown was not enough to stop a manual override. The physical security tokens were high-grade encrypted flash drives specifically designed for this exact doomsday scenario. Without them, the hostile lockout would stall, giving Julian enough time to execute the transfer. "Where are the tokens?" Elias asked. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my face. "They are locked inside a military-grade biometric safe in Julian's private home office. The safe requires his fingerprint and a retinal scan. We cannot hack it remotely, and getting a physical warrant will take hours. We will miss the deadline." I glanced at the digital clock glowing red on the wall. It was 3:15 in the morning. We had less than 5 hours to breach an impenetrable safe, retrieve the tokens, and insert them into the server before Julian unleashed financial Armageddon. The situation seemed entirely impossible. But then my forensic mind snagged on a single crucial detail from my agonizing years trapped in that marriage. Julian was deeply arrogant, but he was also deeply paranoid. He was constantly terrified of being locked out of his own wealth. He never trusted digital backups. "He has an analog override," I stated, my voice gaining a sudden, dangerous momentum. "He installed a manual combination dial on the back of the safe, just in case the biometric scanners failed during a power grid collapse." "And who has the combination?" Elias asked, his eyes narrowing. "Julian never wrote it down," I explained, pacing the length of the war room. "He knew I could find anything he wrote down. He memorized it, but he was terrified of forgetting it. He gave the backup combination to exactly one person. The only person in the world he believed would never ever betray his financial interests." I stopped pacing and looked directly at Elias. "His sister, Isabella. I need to get those physical security tokens out of that safe by 8 o'clock this morning," I said, reaching for my phone. "And the only way I'm getting them is by making a deal with the woman who just found out her husband is having a baby with her brother's mistress. Isabella has the code, and I am going to make her use it." The armored SUV tore through the quiet suburban streets, leaving the wreckage of Isabella behind us. The transition from the wealthy residential enclaves to the towering steel and glass canyons of the financial district took less than 40 minutes. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. It was exactly 7 in the morning when my driver pulled up to the imposing facade of Julian corporate headquarters. The building usually hummed with the arrogant energy of early rising traders and ambitious analysts, but today the plaza was completely dead. The SEC raid had gutted the lower floors yesterday, and the regular staff had clearly been instructed to stay away. But the executive suites at the very top operated by their own set of rules. "We have less than an hour," I stated, staring up at the monolithic skyscraper. "If those tokens are not inserted into the mainframe by 8 o'clock, Julian initiates the crypto transfer." Elias stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate suit with predatory calm. "Then we suggest we do not waste time in the lobby." We pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the expansive marble atrium. The silence was immediate and oppressive. There was no receptionist at the sweeping mahogany desk. Instead, a solid wall of tactical muscle blocked the biometric security gates leading to the executive elevators. There were 6 of them. They were not standard corporate security guards in cheap blazers. These men wore dark tactical gear earpieces and the aggressive hostile posture of highly paid private mercenaries. Julian had spared no expense to fortify his bunker. The lead guard, a massive man with a thick neck and cold, dead eyes, stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. His hand rested dangerously close to the holster at his hip. "The building is closed," he barked, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "Executive orders. No entry without direct authorization from the CEO. Turn around and walk out or you will be removed." I did not break my stride, continuing forward until I was standing mere inches from the security barricade. "I am a majority stakeholder holding federal clearance," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "You are currently obstructing a federal asset seizure. Step aside immediately." The lead guard laughed, a harsh grating sound. "I do not care if you are the President of the United States, lady. Mr. Vance signs my paychecks. Nobody goes up those elevators." I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. I was preparing to outline exactly how many years in federal prison he would serve for aiding and abetting a massive financial crime, but Elias stepped forward smoothly, cutting me off. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not posture or threaten physical violence. He simply operated on a frequency of power that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. As he moved, a fleet of 4 matte black SUVs abruptly jumped the curb outside, screeching to a halt right in front of the glass doors. A dozen of Elias' own security personnel stepped out silently, securing the entire perimeter of the building. The mercenary guards in the lobby immediately tensed, hands dropping to their weapons. "Relax!" Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a straight razor. "Nobody is going to shoot anyone today, especially not for free." The lead guard narrowed his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I am talking about your payroll," Elias explained casually, leaning against the biometric gate. "You are standing here willing to commit a federal felony because you believe Julian Vance is a billionaire who signs your checks. But you are operating on outdated information." Elias glanced at me, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "At exactly midnight last night, my colleague here successfully executed a hostile lock out of the firm's primary operating accounts." Elias continued, addressing the entire line of mercenaries. "She legally froze the entire treasury architecture. That includes the shadow accounts Julian uses to pay private contractors like you." The lead guard's expression shifted from aggressive to uncertain. "You are bluffing." "Am I?" Elias challenged, raising a single eyebrow. "Check your accounts. Your weekly direct deposits usually hit at 3 in the morning, do they not? Take out your phone right now and look at your balance." A tense silence fell over the lobby. The lead guard hesitated, then slowly reached into his tactical vest and pulled out his smartphone. Several of the men behind him mirrored the action. I watched the exact moment reality shattered their loyalty. The lead guard's jaw tightened, his eyes widening as he stared at the screen. The pending deposit from the Julian firm had vanished, replaced by a glaring red insufficient funds notification. "He is broke," Elias stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "Julian Vance is currently hiding upstairs, panicking because the SEC is seizing his entire empire. The check he wrote you bounced 4 hours ago. So ask yourself a very simple question. Are you really going to take a bullet, catch a federal indictment, and go to prison for a disgraced felon who cannot even afford to pay your hourly rate?" The mercenaries looked at each other, the hostile energy draining from the room in an instant. Loyalty bought with money completely evaporates the second the money disappears. The lead guard looked at his phone one last time, let out a string of vicious curses, and shoved the device back into his vest. He stepped back, breaking the defensive line. "We are done here," he barked to his men. "Clear out." Without another word, the wall of tactical muscle dissolved. They walked past us, heading straight for the exits, abandoning their posts without a backward glance. Elias swiped a master keycard he had legally requisitioned from the feds over the scanner. The glass gate slid open with a soft chime. "After you," Elias said, gesturing toward the VIP elevator. We stepped into the wood-paneled elevator cab, and I pressed the button for the penthouse floor. The doors slid shut, sealing us in. The digital display counted down the floors, climbing higher and higher into the heart of Julian's fortress. My grip tightened on the slip of paper in my pocket. The 6-digit code Isabella had given me felt like a burning coal against my palm. We were minutes away from retrieving the physical security tokens and ending this nightmare permanently. The elevator chimed smoothly, signaling our arrival at the executive penthouse. The heavy steel doors slid open and I stepped out into the expansive reception area. The scene waiting for me was absolute unhinged chaos. The luxurious suite was completely destroyed. The glass walls of the boardroom were shattered, covering the plush carpets in jagged, glittering shards. Expensive modern art was ripped from the walls. But the true madness was centered in the middle of the bullpen. Julian Vance, the polished, aristocratic CEO, was screaming at the top of his lungs. He was drenched in sweat, his custom-tailored shirt ripped open at the collar. In his hands, he wielded a heavy steel golf club, swinging it with terrifying violent force. He brought the club down repeatedly, smashing a row of external hard drives and server towers into unrecognizable piles of twisted metal and sparking wires. A handful of remaining loyal executives cowered in the corners of the room, watching their leader completely lose his mind in a spectacular psychotic meltdown. Julian raised the club for another devastating strike, but the sound of the elevator doors caught his attention. He froze mid-swing, his chest heaving as he slowly turned his head. His wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto me, standing calmly in the doorway with Elias Thorne at my shoulder. Julian's face contorted into a mask of pure, feral hatred. He tightened his grip on the steel shaft, turning his body and pointing the heavy head of the golf club directly at my face. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stared down the barrel of the polished steel shaft aimed directly between my eyes. Julian gripped the golf club so tightly, his knuckles were completely white, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths that sounded incredibly loud in the devastated reception area. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of the aristocratic veneer he had spent his entire life cultivating. His custom suit was ruined, his hair was matted to his forehead with sweat, and his eyes were completely devoid of sanity. Elias shifted slightly beside me, a subtle shifting of weight that instantly telegraphed his readiness for violence. I reached out and placed a single flat palm against Elias' forearm, silently ordering him to hold his ground. Julian wanted me to show fear, he wanted me to cower. I refused to give him the satisfaction. I stepped out of the elevator and walked straight into the room, my high heels crunching loudly over the shattered glass scattered across the expensive carpet. "What are you doing here?" Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips. His voice cracking under the strain of his absolute hysteria. "You have no right to be on this floor. This is private property." I ignored him entirely, scanning the room. Beyond the ruined reception desk, the executive boardroom was a glass-enclosed fishbowl. Inside, a group of older men in rumpled luxury suits were huddled together in the far corner. These were the remaining members of Julian's executive board. The men who had rubber-stamped his fraudulent ledgers, approved his exorbitant bonuses, and turned a blind eye to Marcus' offshore laundering schemes. Now they looked like terrified hostages watching their golden goose transform into a rabid dog. Julian followed my gaze and snapped his attention back to his terrified executives. "Call building security!" he roared, swinging the golf club wildly through the air and smashing another pristine computer monitor off an adjacent desk. The screen exploded in a shower of sparks and black plastic. "Call the police. She is trespassing. Have her arrested right now." Not a single man in that boardroom moved. They had all looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows. They had all seen the fleet of black SUVs surrounding the building, and they all knew that the local police were not coming to save them from a federal financial siege. When no one reached for a phone, Julian let out a sound of pure guttural frustration. He dropped the golf club, letting it clatter loudly against the ruined floor. He realized that physical intimidation was useless against me, and that external security had completely abandoned him. His manic energy suddenly shifted, sharpening into a hyper-focused, desperate kind of clarity. He pivoted away from me and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom. "Fine," Julian snarled, throwing the doors open and glaring at his board of directors. "The SEC asset freeze does not legally take effect until the markets open. We still have a window. I am calling an emergency executive session right now. I am officially proposing a motion to liquidate all Tier 1 capital reserves and wire the balance into our decentralized contingency accounts." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the executives. They exchanged panicked, terrified glances. What Julian was proposing was the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike. He was asking them to manually drain billions of dollars of client funds and hide the money in untraceable crypto wallets before the federal regulators could seize it. "You cannot do that," one of the older board members stammered, his voice shaking as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Julian, the SEC is already in the building. Marcus has been arrested. If we authorize a mass liquidation now, they will crucify us." "We are already being crucified," Julian shouted, slamming his fist against the mahogany table. "Do you think they are going to let you keep your bonuses? Do you think they are not coming for your summer homes and your yacht memberships? The feds are going to strip us down to the bone. If we wire the funds into the contingency accounts, now we maintain leverage. We maintain our wealth. I just need a quorum. I need 2 board members to second the motion and authorize the transfer. Who is with me?" The desperation in this room was palpable. These men were cowards, but they were also incredibly greedy. 2 of the executives standing near the back men I recognized as Julian's most loyal cronies slowly raised their trembling hands. They were heavily implicated in Marcus' fraudulent trades, and they knew their only chance at avoiding total financial ruin was to secure a cut of the offshore crypto funds. "The motion passes," Julian declared, a triumphant manic grin spreading across his face. I walked straight past the shattered glass doors and directly into the boardroom. I did not ask for permission. I stepped right up to the head of the massive mahogany table and dropped my heavy leather briefcase onto the polished wood. The sharp, authoritative thud echoed through the room, making the 2 loyalist board members jump. I flipped open the latches, pulled out my encrypted tablet, and immediately synced it to the boardroom's primary presentation system. The massive digital screen on the far wall flared to life, casting a harsh white light over the terrified faces of the executives. Before anyone authorizes a single wire transfer, I announced, my voice echoing with absolute icy authority. "You should know that doing so makes you an accessory to a federal crime." I tapped the screen, and a heavily redacted legal document appeared. It was the emergency federal injunction I had secured hours ago, cross-referenced with the firm debt covenants. As of midnight last night, Julian Vance was legally stripped of his executive authority due to a breach of the moral turpitude clause, I explained, staring directly at the 2 men who had raised their hands. "This firm is currently operating under a hostile lockout protocol. Any board member who aids Julian in moving capital will be immediately charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, and violating the RICO Act. You will not just lose your summer homes. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The 2 loyalist board members instantly turned pale, their raised hands dropping to their sides as if they had touched a hot stove. They physically backed away from the table, putting as much distance between themselves and Julian as possible. Julian threw his head back and laughed. It was a terrifying, unhinged sound that completely lacked any humor. He ignored the terrified board members and rushed toward the master terminal situated at the head of the table. "You think an injunction matters, Maya?" Julian sneered, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. "You are too late. I do not need their vote, and I do not care about your little legal threats. I have the CEO override. I have manual access to the master ledger, and I am hitting send on the transfers right now." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and victorious, and he pressed the enter key. The heavy plastic key clacked loudly under the force of his strike. Julian let out a breathless, ragged gasp of triumph, expecting the immediate satisfaction of a loading bar, the digital confirmation that billions of dollars were currently vanishing into the untraceable ether of decentralized offshore crypto wallets. He braced his hands against the polished mahogany table, staring at the primary display monitor with a manic, hungry grin. He honestly believed he had just checkmated the federal government and secured his illicit fortune. Instead, a sharp, piercing error tone ripped through the dead silence of the boardroom. The massive digital screen on the far wall, directly synced to his master terminal, flashed a violently bright red warning. The words "access denied," rendered in bold, unforgiving block letters, glared back at him, reflecting off the sheen of cold sweat coating his pale face. Julian's victorious grin froze, then instantly rotted into an expression of sheer, uncomprehending horror. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if trying to clear a hallucination. He lunged forward and slammed the enter key again. The error tone blared a second time, louder and more mocking. He frantically began mashing the keyboard, hammering shortcut commands, typing in backdoor administrative bypass codes, and desperately trying to force the transaction through sheer physical violence. Access denied. Access denied. The screen blinked in a relentless, rhythmic pulse of failure. "What did you do?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. He grabbed the heavy mechanical keyboard and hurled it across the room, where it smashed against the glass wall and shattered into pieces. "The injunction has not cleared yet. I am the Chief Executive Officer. I have absolute structural override clearance. This is my firm." I remained perfectly still at the opposite end of the long conference table, completely unbothered by his violent outburst. I reached slowly into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal object I had risked absolutely everything to secure just hours prior. I pulled out a small silver military-grade encrypted security token. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the harsh overhead recessed lighting catch the metallic glint of the drive. "You do not have override authority anymore, Julian," I stated, my voice cutting through his frantic, heavy breathing with absolute icy precision. "Because Isabella gave me the biometric bypass code to your private home safe at 4 o'clock this morning. I pulled the physical master tokens while you were busy destroying your own office. You are completely locked out of the mainframe from the inside." Julian stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a leather executive chair. He collapsed into it, looking exactly like a man who had just been gutted, but had not yet realized he was bleeding to death. He stared at the silver token in my hand, his mouth opening and closing, without producing any sound. "Isabella would not." He finally gasped, shaking his head in frantic denial. "She would never betray me. She knows what is at stake. She is family." "She did not betray you, Julian," I corrected him, my tone dropping into a deadly quiet register. "She survived you. There is a massive difference. When you allow your brother-in-law to launder money and orchestrate a secret life with a 20-year-old mistress, you forfeit the right to demand blind family loyalty. I offered her a choice between going down with your sinking ship or keeping her personal trust fund intact. She chose exactly what you would have chosen. She chose herself." I turned my attention away from his pathetic crumbling display and focused directly on the remaining board of directors. The older men in their rumpled luxury suits were watching this exchange with mounting, unadulterated terror. They realized they were trapped in a room with a sinking captain, and they were desperately looking for a lifeboat. I tapped the surface of my encrypted tablet, projecting a new document onto the massive screen, replacing the glaring red warning with a dense, heavily highlighted legal contract. "Gentlemen," I announced, pacing slowly along the length of the mahogany table, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "Allow me to introduce you to the reality of your current financial and legal situation. I am not simply executing a temporary hostile lockout based on pending federal indictments. I am officially executing a hostile takeover of this entire firm." Julian let out a derisive, wet laugh, wiping a smear of blood and sweat from his forehead. "You cannot take over the firm, you stupid, ungrateful housewife." He spat, his arrogance momentarily flaring through his panic. "You do not have the capital to buy the voting shares. You have nothing." "I do not need to buy your shares, Julian," I replied, smiling with razor-sharp intent. "I already own your debt." I gestured gracefully toward the illuminated screen. When Julian arrogantly defaulted on his personal estate mortgage last month, a mortgage which my private limited liability company quietly purchased from his primary lender through a series of shell corporations, he triggered a highly specific cross-default clause. This clause is deeply embedded in the original seed loans that capitalized this entire firm a decade ago. I let the heavy silence hang for a fraction of a second, ensuring every executive in the room understood the catastrophic gravity of my words. Under United States corporate law, I continued, my voice echoing in the glass-enclosed room. The primary debt holder possesses the legal right to execute an immediate hostile takeover of the corporate entity if executive fraud is proven. Your chief executive officer is currently under federal investigation for massive wire fraud. His managing partner is currently sitting in a holding cell wearing steel handcuffs. And Julian just attempted to manually wire billions of dollars of client funds into an offshore decentralized crypto account right in front of all of you. The fraud is absolute and undeniable. The two loyalist board members who had raised their hands just moments ago to authorize the illegal transfer instantly turned the color of ash. Their loyalty to Julian vaporized in a split second. They were looking at a walking corpse. The entire firm, the accounts, the client lists, and the underlying debt structure were legally entirely in my hands. Julian realized the absolute totality of his defeat in that exact moment. The remaining arrogant defiance completely drained from his body, leaving behind a hollow, shivering shell of a man. His shoulders slumped, and he gasped for air, as if the oxygen had been violently sucked directly from the boardroom. He looked wildly at his board of directors, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally. "Buy me out!" Julian pleaded, his voice degenerating into a pathetic whining beg. "You have to buy me out. Force a settlement. We can negotiate terms." The board members remained completely silent, staring at him with cold, calculated detachment. They were entirely done with him. They were already calculating how to save themselves from the federal prosecutors. Julian turned his desperate, bloodshot, manic eyes back to me. He slammed his hands onto the table, pushing himself up. "Just give me my severance package," he screamed, his voice breaking entirely. "I built this place. I am the founder. I own 51% of this company. You cannot just take it away from me. Buy me out and I will walk away quietly. Just give me my money." I looked down at the man who had tormented me, manipulated me, gaslit me, and deliberately tried to leave me ruined and penniless in the street. He was actively begging for a golden parachute, desperately clinging to the crumbling illusion of his aristocratic wealth. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood of the conference table, leaning in incredibly close so he could see the absolute absence of mercy burning in my eyes. I let a long, agonizing second pass. I smiled coldly. "Let us talk about the exact value of your shares." I turned away from him and tapped the screen on my tablet, bringing up the master forensic accounting ledger I had spent the last 72 hours building. The massive monitor behind me shifted from the dense legal statutes to a stark black-and-white spreadsheet. It was not a polished investor deck or a carefully curated quarterly report. It was a financial autopsy. I highlighted the top line using a digital pointer. "This is your reported operating capital, Julian. $2.4 billion. A very impressive vanity metric until we start applying the reality of your current legal situation." I swiped my finger across the glass screen, dropping the first financial guillotine. "Let us deduct the $400 million Marcus successfully embezzled before the federal raid. That is money currently frozen in federal evidence lockers that you are legally required to refund to your clients." The spreadsheet recalculated instantly. The board members let out a collective gasp. I added the next line item. "Next, we must account for the impending Securities and Exchange Commission penalties. For institutional fraud, lack of fiduciary oversight, and gross negligence, the SEC historically calculates fines at 3 times the stolen amount. We will estimate a highly conservative $1.2 billion in federal fines." The number plummeted. Julian gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Wait," he stammered, his voice shaking violently. "We have brand equity. We have the client roster, the global real estate portfolio. You cannot just wipe that out." I cut him off smoothly, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "You have absolutely nothing." I swiped the screen one final time. "Because we must now deduct the leveraged corporate debt. The toxic mezzanine loans you took out against the firm to fund your lavish lifestyle, your private jets, and to float your failing offshore investments. The exact same debt that my holding company now owns in full." The final number at the bottom of the screen flashed in a bright red font. It was not zero. It was a deeply catastrophic negative territory. Your 51% controlling interest is mathematically worthless. Julian, stated the acoustics of the glass boardroom, amplifying the coldness in my voice. In fact, considering the legal liabilities, you are personally liable for hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate deficit. Your shares are toxic waste. The two loyalist board members who had supported him only moments ago now stared at the screen in absolute horror. They physically backed away from the table, putting as much distance between themselves and Julian as possible. He was no longer a powerful CEO. He was a walking federal indictment. You wanted a severance package? I continued stepping away from the projector and pacing slowly down the length of the conference table. You begged this board for a buyout. Under the corporate hostile takeover statutes, I am legally permitted to execute a forced buyout to cover the exact damages you inflicted upon the minority shareholders. As the primary debt holder, I am executing my right to acquire your shares to mitigate the firm's catastrophic collapse. I stopped walking when I was standing directly in front of him. Julian was physically vibrating. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his bloodshot eyes. He looked up at me, a broken, hyperventilating shell of the arrogant billionaire who had once thought he ruled the world. He dropped the golf club completely. It hit the floor with a dull, hollow clank. I unclasped the gold hardware of my designer purse. I reached inside and pulled out my leather wallet. The room was so incredibly quiet, you could hear the crisp sound of the paper currency sliding out of the billfold. I extracted a crisp $20 bill and a $10 bill. I held the currency in my right hand, letting him stare at it. You publicly established my market value at the charity gala, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a fierce, penetrating whisper that carried to every corner of the destroyed boardroom. You humiliated me in front of the entire city. You called me a cheap accessory, so I am returning the favor. I stepped into his personal space and slapped the $30 flat against his sweat-soaked chest. I am legally acquiring your 51% controlling stake, your legacy and your entire career, I declared, staring straight into his terrified eyes, for exactly $30. The bills fluttered from his chest and drifted slowly to the shattered floor. Julian let out a choked, agonizing sob. The absolute reality of his destruction finally broke his mind. His knees buckled beneath him. He dropped to the floor, landing hard on the shards of broken glass. His hands desperately scrambled over the ruined carpet, his bloodied fingers grabbing at the crumpled $20 and $10 bills. He clutched the $30 to his chest, weeping uncontrollably over the ashes of his empire. Before anyone could speak, a sharp electronic chime echoed from the reception area. The private executive elevator doors slid open with a heavy mechanical thud. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets bearing the yellow letters FBI flooded onto the penthouse floor. They marched straight past the ruined servers, their boots crunching on the glass as they entered the boardroom with their weapons drawn. Julian Vance, the lead agent, barked, stepping forward and pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for attempting to flee federal jurisdiction and the willful destruction of financial evidence. The heavy steel cuffs clicked shut with a brutal finality that echoed through the shattered boardroom. Julian did not fight them. The fight had been completely drained out of him, leaving nothing but a hollow, sweating husk of a man. His arms were wrenched behind his back, forcing his chest forward, but his right hand remained tightly clenched around the crumpled $20 and $10 bills I had thrown at him. He gripped that $30 like it was a life preserver in a freezing ocean. The Loyalist board members pressed their backs against the glass walls, making themselves as small and invisible as possible as the federal agents swarmed the room. They averted their eyes, desperate to avoid any association with the disgraced CEO, being marched toward the freight elevator. Elias stepped to the side, clearing a path for the agents. He offered Julian a mockingly polite nod as the agents hauled him past us. Julian did not look at him. He did not look at me. His eyes were completely vacant, staring fixedly at the floor as his expensive Italian leather shoes dragged across the broken glass. We gave them a 2-minute head start before Elias and I boarded the executive elevator to follow them down to the lobby. The descent was quiet. The digital display blinked methodically, counting down the floors to Julian's ultimate public execution. I pulled a compact mirror from my purse, smoothing a stray lock of hair and checking my lipstick. I needed to look absolutely flawless for the cameras. My public relations team had received my automated signal exactly 12 minutes ago. When the elevator doors parted in the grand lobby, the visual assault was immediate. Through the soaring glass facade of the building, I could see a massive, chaotic sea of flashing red and blue police lights, blinding camera flashes, and a swarm of aggressive journalists. The rhythmic thumping of news helicopters vibrated through the reinforced glass, shaking the very foundation of the corporate headquarters. The federal agents were actively dragging Julian through the revolving doors, pushing their way into the media circus. The moment the reporters saw him, the crowd erupted into a deafening roar of overlapping questions. But cutting through the mechanical whir of the helicopters and the shouting journalists was a familiar hysterical shriek. My eyes locked onto the source. Julian's mother Eleanor was clawing at the police barricade. She wore a mink coat thrown hastily over silk pajamas, her face contorted in an ugly mask of pure denial and rage. She watched her golden boy, her perfect aristocratic son, being shoved toward a waiting armored federal transport vehicle. "Leave him alone!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking as she slammed her hands against the metal barricade. "He is a good man. He did nothing wrong. It is her fault. She orchestrated this. She is a witch who ruined a good man." Julian was roughly forced into the back of the federal SUV, the heavy door slamming shut and cutting off his mother's hysterical defense. The vehicle immediately tore away from the curb, sirens blaring, leaving Eleanor sobbing against the barricades. Elias glanced at me as we stood just inside the lobby doors. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his tone indicating he already knew the answer. I adjusted the collar of my blazer. "Open the doors, Elias." We stepped out into the freezing morning air, and the media frenzy instantly pivoted. The cameras swiveled away from the departing federal convoy and locked directly onto me. I walked down the marble steps with measured, deliberate grace. I did not shield my face. I did not rush. I walked straight toward the barricades, looking every inch the billionaire architect of their morning headline. A surge of reporters lunged forward, shoving heavy microphones and digital recorders over the metal barriers. The questions battered against me in a chaotic wave. Maya Cross, are you taking over the firm? What is the extent of the fraud? Did you report your husband to the SEC? One voice, louder and sharper than the rest, pierced through the noise. A seasoned financial reporter thrust a microphone directly into my path. "Is it true you orchestrated the downfall of your husband's empire?" I stopped walking. I turned my body and looked directly into the black lens of the primary broadcasting camera. I let a heartbeat of absolute silence command the crowd, forcing the shouting reporters to quiet down and hang on my next word. I did not orchestrate his downfall. I stated, my voice perfectly level, carrying a chilling crystalline clarity. I simply audited his ego. Men who view women as disposable assets often forget who balances the books. The reporters erupted into absolute chaos, shouting desperately for a follow-up quote, but I was already moving. Elias placed a firm hand on my lower back, guiding me through a narrow corridor of security personnel to our waiting town car. I slid into the leather interior, the heavy door shutting behind me and sealing out the frantic noise of the press. By noon, that single quote was playing on an endless loop across every major financial network. The news cycle went completely rabid. Digital publications printed my face alongside headlines declaring a hostile corporate takeover of unprecedented scale. Opinion pieces hailed me as a ruthless financial tactician. I had become an overnight icon for absolute merciless empowerment. I spent the remainders of the day inside my command center, securing the transitioning corporate assets and appointing an interim crisis management board to stabilize the panicked markets. By the time the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long shadows across my office, the adrenaline had finally burned out, leaving a cold, solid core of satisfaction. I poured myself a single glass of expensive bourbon and stood by the window watching the city lights flicker to life. The war was effectively over. I had systematically dismantled the men who thought they could discard me, and I now owned the very empire they had used to oppress me. The sharp ringing of my private cell phone shattered the quiet solitude of the room. I walked over to the desk and glanced at the caller ID. It displayed an unknown number, but the origin code indicated a county correctional facility. I tapped the screen and accepted the call, putting it on speaker. An automated voice filled the room. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the county jail. To accept, press 1. I pressed the button, taking a slow sip of my bourbon. "Maya." The voice on the other end was rough, frantic, and hollowed out by fear. It was Marcus. I did not answer him. I let him sweat in the silence of the monitored line. "Maya, please do not hang up." Marcus begged, the cocky arrogance of the previous night entirely erased from his vocabulary. "I saw the news on the television in the holding area. I know Julian is finished. I know you took the company. What do you want, Marcus?" I asked, my voice betraying absolutely no emotion. "You get exactly 1 minute before I disconnect." "I want to make a deal," he said, his breath hitching audibly. "Julian threw me under the bus with the offshore accounts, but I know where the rest of the physical assets are hidden. I know where he buried the Cayman Island bearer bonds. I will give you everything, Maya. The locations, the account numbers, the proxy names. I will hand you the keys to the rest of the kingdom." And in exchange, I asked, staring at the amber liquid in my glass. "I need you to buy me the best federal defense attorney in the country," Marcus pleaded. "I need a protective legal shield before Julian tries to pin the entire conspiracy on me to reduce his own sentence. Please, Maya. You won. I will give you everything he has left. We can make a deal." I took another slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the silence stretch out and strangle him. Through the speaker of the phone, I could hear the frantic, ragged edge of his breathing, echoing from whatever bleak concrete room they allowed him to make this single collect call from. Marcus was a man accustomed to extreme luxury, to silk sheets and $100 cocktails. The stark reality of a stainless steel toilet and a plastic mattress was clearly breaking his mind faster than I had anticipated. "I can give you the exact coordinates of the offshore servers," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I know the passcodes. Julian changed them last week, but I watched him type the numerical sequence. I have the absolute leverage you need to completely bury him, Maya. You just need to get Elias to pull some strings with the prosecuting attorneys. A plea deal, immunity, just get me out of here." I set my heavy crystal glass down on the mahogany desk. The amber liquid settled perfectly still. "It is not just me," Marcus begged, the desperation flooding the encrypted line. "Chloe is pregnant. My assistant. She is having my baby, Maya. I cannot go to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I need to be a father. You have to understand. You are a woman. You understand family. Please have some mercy." The sheer audacity of the request was almost physically repulsive. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the polished wood of the desk, staring into the dark reflection of the window. "Mercy," I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "You sat at my dining table, Marcus. You drank my expensive wine. You smiled at me during holiday dinners while actively helping my husband drain my personal accounts and humiliate me in front of our peers. You watched him parade his mistresses through our social circles. You enabled my abuse at every single turn." "Maya, please. I was just following orders," he sobbed, his voice dissolving into a wet panic. "You laughed when I was humiliated," I continued, my voice dropping into an icy register, completely devoid of any human empathy. "You thought I was weak. You thought I was stupid. You stole from your own family to fund a secret life with a 20-year-old assistant. You made your choices, Marcus. Now you get to experience the absolute consequences." "I can give you Julian," he screamed, frantic and terrified. "I already have Julian," I replied coldly. "I do not need your bearer bonds or your proxy names. I already own the debt, I own the firm, I own everything. The only deal you are getting is the exact one the federal prosecutor hands you." I reached out and tapped the red icon on the digital screen. The call disconnected instantly, plunging my office back into perfect, serene silence. I opened the phone settings and permanently blocked the facility number. The dead weight of Marcus and his pathetic excuses vanished into the void. The following morning felt remarkably clean. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. While I sat in a plush leather chair sipping an espresso in the pristine offices of my legal team, Julian was sitting in a windowless cinder-block interrogation room at the federal holding facility downtown. My lead attorney had taken the final divorce decree directly to the jail, thanks to the overwhelming mountain of irrefutable evidence proving Julian's massive financial fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The ironclad prenuptial agreement he had forced me to sign a decade ago had been completely shattered. The extensive criminal fraud voided his legal protections and left his personal assets entirely exposed to the corporate debt I now held. My attorney later described the scene to me with clinical precision. Julian had been marched into the interrogation room wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy chain around his waist. He had not slept. His face was gray and his eyes were sunk in hollow pits of pure defeat. The towering arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely eradicated, replaced by the shivering terror of a man facing 50 years in a federal prison. When my attorney slid the thick stack of divorce papers across the scratched metal table, Julian did not argue, he did not yell, he did not threaten to destroy me. He simply stared at the signature line. The decree stripped him of absolutely everything: the penthouse, the vacation homes, the luxury cars, the offshore accounts. Every single asset was seized to satisfy the catastrophic debt he owed to my holding company. He was left with nothing but his highly publicized public humiliation and a mountain of mounting legal fees he had absolutely no way to pay. Julian picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the prison guards. His hand shook so violently he could barely form the letters. He signed the document severing our marriage and officially finalizing his absolute financial ruin. He surrendered the entire kingdom from a concrete cage. By noon, the legal machinery had processed the paperwork. I stood inside the grand marble foyer of the county courthouse, waiting for the clerk to hand me the stamped, certified copy of the final decree. The building was quiet, the heavy classical architecture projecting an aura of permanent authority. The clerk slid the manila folder across the counter. I took it, feeling the physical weight of the paper in my hands. It was remarkably light for something that represented 10 years of psychological warfare and my ultimate liberation. I walked toward the heavy oak exit doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished stone floors. I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The air was fresh and sharp. I stood at the top of the wide concrete steps looking out over the busy city street. The world was continuing to turn, completely unaware that a massive corporate empire had just changed hands and a tyrant had been quietly erased. At the bottom of the steps, parked illegally next to a fire hydrant, was a sleek black luxury sedan. Elias Thorne was leaning casually against the polished hood of the car. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his hands tucked effortlessly into his pockets. The cool breeze ruffled his dark hair as he watched me descend the wide steps. I walked down toward him, clutching the folder containing my absolute freedom to my chest. The tight, rigid tension in my shoulders, the invisible armor I had worn for months, finally began to completely dissolve. I had won. The brutal war was over. Elias straightened up as I approached. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his dark, intense eyes. He looked at the legal folder in my hands, and then looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of profound respect and dangerous charm. "So," Elias asked, his voice rich with anticipation and a hint of dark amusement, "what is next for the $30 woman?" I looked at Elias Thorne leaning against the black sedan, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. He was waiting for an answer. I tightened my grip on the manila folder containing my absolute freedom, feeling the sharp edges of the thick legal paper pressing into my palms. "What is next?" I echoed, letting a slow, genuine smile break across my face. "I am going to build an empire of my own, Elias, and I am going to build it right over the ashes of his." 6 months later, those ashes had completely settled, and a new foundation had been poured in concrete and steel. The brutal, freezing winter had yielded to a bright, unforgiving Manhattan spring. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner penthouse office, looking out over the sprawling architectural canyon of the financial district. The morning sun caught the frosted lettering on the heavy glass double doors behind me, casting a sharp shadow across the polished marble floor. $30 Consulting Limited Liability Company. It was a private joke, a daily reminder, and a relentless warning to absolutely anyone who walked through those doors seeking my services. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored midnight blue suit. The fabric was immaculate, the cut razor-sharp and unyielding. I no longer wore clothes designed to make me a passive, acceptable accessory for a billionaire husband. I wore armor of my own choosing. I had built a specialized crisis management and corporate acquisition firm that operated as an apex predator in the Wall Street ecosystem. We hunted corrupt executives. The men who had tried to bury me were currently locked in a very different kind of cage. Julian and Marcus had been stripped of their tailored Italian suits, and their boundless arrogance replaced by standard-issue federal prison uniforms. The presiding judge had shown absolutely no mercy during their sentencing hearing. The sheer staggering scale of their wire fraud, embezzlement, offshore tax evasion, and witness tampering had secured them both mandatory minimums of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Julian had spent his entire criminal trial looking over his shoulder, desperately waiting for a high-powered rescue from his political connections that never came. He was bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and permanently erased from the social and financial world he once thought he owned unconditionally. He had signed his divorce papers from a concrete holding cell, left with nothing but his public disgrace and a mountain of mounting legal debts he had absolutely no way to pay. Marcus had tried to plea bargain his way out, crying to the federal prosecutors about his pregnant mistress, but they did not need his cooperation. I had already handed the government an airtight forensic ledger that mapped every single stolen dollar. Isabella had been the only member of that toxic family smart enough to read the writing on the wall. She had liquidated her remaining unencumbered trust funds and quietly relocated to a small coastal town in southern Europe. Last week, an unmarked envelope arrived at my office bearing a French postmark. Inside was a single piece of heavy cream cardstock with 2 words written in elegant, familiar script. Thank you. She had chosen her own survival over blind family loyalty, and I respected her for breaking the cycle. She was finally free, and so was I. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open, interrupting my quiet reflection. Elias Thorne walked in carrying 2 cups of black coffee and a thick leather-bound corporate dossier. He did not look like a corporate savior or a white knight riding in to rescue a damsel in distress. He looked exactly like what he was, my equal, my trusted business partner. He set one of the coffees on my pristine mahogany desk and dropped the heavy dossier right beside it. The file landed with a satisfying authoritative thud that echoed in the cavernous office. "We have a massive new acquisition target," he announced, leaning back against the edge of the desk and crossing his arms over his chest. "Richard Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global Logistics." I turned away from the window and walked over to the desk, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. Richard Sterling. I repeated, calculating the variables instantly. He was just indicted by the Securities and Exchange Commission for offshore tax evasion and aggressive corporate espionage yesterday morning. His global board of directors must be in a state of absolute panic. Exactly, Elias said, his lips curving into a sharp, predatory smile. And his board of directors does not want a traditional crisis management firm. They do not want a bloated team of corporate lawyers billing by the hour to negotiate a quiet, drawn-out settlement. They specifically requested the woman who orchestrated the hostile takeover of a Wall Street firm in a single weekend. They want the $30 woman to audit his ego, freeze his assets, and restructure the entire global entity before the federal government dismantles it. I looked down at the heavy leather dossier resting on my desk. Inside those pages was another arrogant, powerful man who believed he was entirely untouchable. Another massive corporate empire built on a fragile foundation of leverage, deception, and lies. It was exactly the kind of puzzle I loved to dismantle piece by piece. I reached across the desk and picked up my solid gold fountain pen. I felt the cold, heavy weight of it resting perfectly between my fingers. I took a deep breath, letting the reality of the moment wash over me. I was completely healed from the trauma of my marriage. I was no longer the silent, forgotten wife shrinking into the background of charity galas and country club dinners, terrified of making a mistake. I was no longer an asset to be managed, a pawn to be traded, or a liability to be discarded when I became inconvenient. I was the architect of my own absolute independence. I looked up at Elias, meeting his dark, intense eyes with unwavering, absolute confidence. We operated flawlessly together, a machine built for corporate warfare. I uncapped the pen and pulled the sterling global logistics contract toward me. "Let us get to work," I said, my voice ringing with authority. I pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name with sharp, decisive strokes. I had been auctioned to the highest bidder as a useless, disposable wife. I walked away as the undisputed master of the game. The story powerfully illustrates that true self-worth cannot be derived from those who view you as a disposable asset. For years, Maya endured manipulation and betrayal, yet her ultimate triumph did not come from seeking Julian's validation. Instead, it came from quietly auditing her own value and leveraging her brilliant intelligence. The profound lesson here is that our greatest strength often lies in the shadows of being underestimated. When we actively reclaim our financial and emotional independence, we rewrite our entire narrative. Never let anyone else dictate your market value. How have you reclaimed your own worth? Share in the comments below.